Happy Sunday, everyone. General Conference weekend. It's always nice going to church in your pajamas. Can't complain about that, although I guess a lot of us did that during COVID too when we were doing Zoom church for everything. But I wanted to focus today on a new development that was announced yesterday, which is this revision and update to the For the Strength of Youth pamphlet. And there's a lot of interesting things when you break down some of the before and after from the past one and the current one. But I want to start with a story. We all are, I think, familiar with this quote from Joseph Smith about, teaching correct principles and letting them govern themselves. This was not documented by Joseph in his journal or anything. We have this from John Taylor, who in the Millennial Star in 1851, years after Joseph was murdered, who reported this story. So this is from John Taylor. And he says this. He says, "Some years ago in Nauvoo, a gentleman in my hearing, a member of the legislature, asked Joseph Smith how it was that he was enabled to govern so many people and to preserve such order, remarking at the same time that it was impossible for them to do it anywhere else." So this is an elected official who's seeing Nauvoo and wondering, wow, how are you managing all these people so well? Mr. Smith remarked that it was very easy to do that. "How?" responded the gentleman. "To us it is very difficult." Mr. Smith, Joseph, replied, "I teach them correct principles and they govern themselves." So maybe it wasn't that exact wording. Of course, here he's recalling years later what the quote is. We have this from a kind of secondhand source of John Taylor, who claims to have overheard this. Nonetheless, that's where we get this story. But what I find interesting about John Taylor sharing this is, mind you, 1851, post-Joseph, early Mormonism, and a few years later, we have a different development. The Saints are in Utah. Brigham's in charge, trying to kind of maintain order. And there was a lot of concern for the kind of lackadaisical attitude of many members of the church. And many leaders felt that a lot of members were not operating at the level they should. They were not acting in a way that saints ought to. Of course, many leaders themselves were guilty of the same, but there started to be this early effort of what later became the temple interview questions, this kind of catechism or list of like thou shalt nots and thou shalts that were circulating in the early church that bishops were using and other leaders were starting to incorporate to determine the worthiness of the members of the church. Now this has been standardized in recent decades as a kind of barometer for worthiness for entrance in the temple, when that did not exist in the early days. And, we have, I guess, maybe something similar a little bit with what used to be called tithing settlement, what is now called tithing declaration. These opportunities for a bishop to kind of review and ask about the worthiness of members. But typically, as we know, this has been standardized into admittance to the temple. Earlier on, it was not quite that. And these questions are rather interesting. I'm going to share a few. This is from 1857. Again, this was not, from my research, that I can find any type of top-down decree in the early days. It was kind of this grassroots effort from various clergy and perhaps stake presidents and others to try and improve the perceived worthiness of the members of the church. I couldn't find that this was Brigham himself, instituting this basically. But here's some of these questions. Again, 1851, John Taylor sharing the story about Joseph saying, "Teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves." 6 years later, this list of questions starts to circulate. Here's just a few. Have you betrayed your brethren or sisters in anything? Have you taken and made use of property not your own, without the consent of the owner? Have you cut hay where you had no right to, or turned your animals into another person's grain or field without his knowledge and consent? Kind of a, farmer's version of theft, you might say. Have you borrowed anything that you have not returned or paid for? Have you coveted anything not your own? Have you branded an animal that you did not know to be your own? Have you taken water to irrigate with when it belonged to another person at the time you used it? Do you wash your body and have your family do so as often as health and cleanliness require and circumstances will permit? So, I mean, it goes on, but that gives you a taste of some of these early questions to try and shore up the perceived worthiness and spirituality of the early members of the church. This very kind of micromanagerial or granular set of questions that was aligned around specific behaviors that were perceived to be a problem. Of course, this was a very different time back then. People's hygiene was not, where it is today. And so we don't really get asked today whether we're taking, daily showers as a condition of our worthiness. So these questions were for a particular time and people who were dealing with other challenges that maybe we aren't. But I share that because to me, it's a little bit of an interesting contrast to see John Taylor highlight this Joseph Smith story that we all know and many of us love about how he would just teach correct principles and then let people govern themselves. And then a few years later, we start to get these questions that were edited and modified and built upon and now have become the temple interview questions. So to me, it's a little bit of an interesting contrast. Now, the reason I bring this up is yesterday in the Saturday sessions of conference, Elder Uchtdorf was tasked with making this announcement of a new version of the For the Strength of Youth pamphlet. For those who aren't familiar with this, the LDS Church has this kind of list of principles and behaviors for young people to follow, kind of the standards of members of the church who are in their teens, basically. And it's gone through modifications over the years. I believe, from what I could tell, the last version that was updated was 2011. And so now we have this updated version in 2022. Now, to me, it's a little bit interesting that Uchtdorf was the one to introduce this new revision, in part because 2.5 years ago in conference, so this is the April 2020 conference, right, as COVID's going crazy. And then here's what Elder Uchtdorf said in that conference 2.5 years ago. Our loving Heavenly Father has not given us every answer. He expects us to figure out many things for ourselves. He expects us to believe even when it's difficult to do so. He expects us to straighten our shoulders and develop a little resolve, a little backbone, and take another step forward. That is the way we learn and grow. Would you honestly want everything spelled out in every detail? Would you honestly want every question answered, every destination mapped out? I believe most of us would tire very quickly of this sort of heavenly micromanagement. We learn the important lessons of life through experience, through learning from our mistakes, through repenting and realizing for ourselves that wickedness never was happiness. That's an interesting point. Through repenting and realizing for ourselves that wickedness was never happiness. So here's Elder Uchtdorf 2.5 years ago. And what I find interesting about this, one of many reasons, if you haven't read it, I found very fascinating a book called, years ago when I read it, David O. Mckay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism. Very fascinating biography, in large part because the biography utilized source documents that have never really before been accessible to how the leadership of the church operates. In this particular case, David O. Mckay had a secretary. Her name was Claire Middlemiss, and she was his secretary throughout his apostleship. And when he became president of the church, rather than use the president's or the first presidency's secretary, which was long the tradition that, when you kind of became the first presidency, you would no longer use your secretary, you would have this kind of standard one. Well, David O. Mckay was like, nah, and he kept Claire. And so Claire was like his longtime secretary. And when Claire Middlemiss passed away, she apparently had all kinds of documents that were not in the first presidency vault. Pretty much everything of interest goes into this vault, only selectively to be obtained by researchers or historians or the broader public. A lot is secret. But Claire Middlemis's notes, meeting minutes, right? Notes, like transcripts, like all kinds of stuff, she kept for whatever reason. Maybe the book said, and I just don't remember, but she kept it. And when she passed away, it's been a little while. It was either her son or her nephew was going through her belongings and, managing the estate and settling up with everything and all these things in her home. And he came across this treasure trove of documents and later approached a historian and said, hey, I've got these documents. Do you want to partner up on doing a book and a biography based on these notes? That historian said yes. The two of them collaborated on what became David O. Mckay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism. Why am I sharing all this? After talking about For the Strength of Youth and President Uchtdorf, or Elder Uchtdorf. I share this because that book was very insightful to see some behind-the-scenes tensions between upper leadership in the church. What is presented, and I think properly and rightly so, is this, united front and total harmony. And maybe that's where things ultimately land in these Thursday meetings and these discussions. They strive for that unity. I think that's a good thing. But they're human, and they have different perspectives and interests and disagreements. I think it's convenient to think that they all just unanimously agree with everything and everything's great, let's move forward. But what you see in that book is substantial disagreement on, key policies and programs of the church, and, Harold B. Lee pushing for, correlation, and other leaders really, disagreeing. You had the whole, certainly Bruce R. McConkie thing and Mormon doctrine and Ezra Taft Benson and 14 fundamentals of following the prophet, and the disagreement within the brethren of, how he portrayed things, and just lots of stuff where publicly we get this perception of they're all behind whatever they all do, but privately as humans, right, there's disagreements and there's, I don't know if dissent is the right word, but there's certainly disagreements. And you read a book like that and you're like, okay, well, if it happened then, like it could be happening today. And I don't know. I just wonder if Elder Uchtdorf didn't have some kind of leadership role in saying, the last For the Strength of Youth pamphlet is really prescriptive in a lot of different things. Maybe we can, create a different version, and there would be others who disagree, perhaps leaders of the church who felt like we needed to be very micromanagerial, versus Elder Uchtdorf, who here in his talk 2.5 years ago is saying, I believe most of us would tire very quickly of this sort of heavenly micromanagement, he says. Whereas I think other people prefer that style. They want to be prescriptive. They think that we need to spell out in detail. Otherwise, they won't know what we mean. And that you can totally sense that there would be that perspective there. So you got to wonder what the discussions were like that led to this new For the Strength of Youth pamphlet, and who needed to kind of come along. What was interesting in that book, David O. Mckay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, is sometimes you'd have to just wait out the other person. If the leader of the church was, disagreeing with correlation, and Harold B. Lee really wanted to push correlation and standardizing everything, you wait for that person to die, and then you move up, and now you get to impose, and introduce what you wanted. I think a modern example of this is the whole, I'll call it anti-Mormon branding, which is funny because we perceive anti-Mormon to be anti-Latter-day Saint, but in this case I'm saying anti-Mormon as in opposing the use of the word Mormon. And President Hinckley, for example, was very supportive of using the Mormon term. He would talk in the media about, how it was a good, term that we embraced, and what Mormons believe and who they are. We had a whole campaign, I'm a Mormon. I filled out one of those profiles, 15 years ago. We were all encouraged to go create a little profile sharing our testimony on the website. We had a whole movie about it. I went to the screening with all the little VIPs and stuff, and it was, what was it called? Why I'm a Mormon? I don't remember what it was called, but you know what I'm talking about. They had that whole little movie that they put together, and everything was Mormon, Mormon, Mormon. And suddenly, right, and President Nelson disagreed back then, but he was not in a position of leadership to say what he wanted. So President Hinckley got what he wanted, and we all culturally adopted or kept using the term. And so now when President Nelson is in authority, suddenly the term Mormon is, a victory for Satan, and, can't do it and shouldn't do it. And so that's a modern example of where we get some of these disagreements, that it's really a waiting game to wait until you're in authority to now say, here's what we're going to do. And you might argue on the flip side that maybe that's in the Lord's program, that's how we achieve progress, is just to wait for the obstinate leaders to die off who wanted something different, and then the Lord can inspire new people to take it in a different direction. I think that's an argument. Really, I think a lot of this is we're humans and we have disagreements, and so I anticipate, I'm just theorizing, that with this revision of the For the Strength of Youth pamphlet, there was likely some in the church leadership who felt like we needed to maintain a very prescriptive approach. But that is not where things landed. However, they developed this way. The new pamphlet, which I've read through, is different in a lot of ways, and I believe in better ways. Ways that are consistent with what Joseph allegedly said, that, teach people correct principles and let them govern themselves. So let's walk through a few examples, just so we can kind of understand the before and the after of what the pamphlet looks like. So, for example, there's in the past pamphlet, the 2011 version, here's a section on tattoos and piercings. It says, do not, so very declarative words, do not disfigure yourself with tattoos or body piercings. Young women, if you desire to have your ears pierced, wear only one pair of earrings. Here is the language from the new pamphlet. The Lord's standard is for you to honor the sacredness of your body, even when that means being different from the world. Let this truth and the Spirit be your guide as you make decisions, especially decisions that have lasting effects on your body. Be wise and faithful and seek counsel from your parents and leaders. That's great. That is, what is the correct principle? Our bodies are a gift from God. They're sacred. We should be okay being different from the world. And then it even says, let this truth and the Spirit be your guide as you make decisions, especially decisions that have lasting effects on your body. That could imply tattoos. That could imply certain piercings that'll permanently leave a hole or whatever. But it doesn't say, do not disfigure yourself with tattoos or body piercings. Of course, the example yesterday was like the Maori and tattoos, that you have these cultural kind of things that have bearing on some of these decisions. And the previous kind of prescriptive, obstinate, thou shalt not, creates problems and does not allow for adaptation and individual agency and cultural kind of flexibility. Here is the section on kind of the word of wisdom from the 2011 version. Do not drink coffee or tea. Never use tobacco products or any form of alcohol. They are addictive and harmful to your body and spirit. I'll skip ahead, blah, blah, blah. Avoid any drink, drug, chemical, or dangerous practice that is used to produce a quote-unquote high or other artificial effect that may harm your body or mind. Some of these include marijuana, hard drugs, prescription or over-the-counter medications. Use of these substances can lead to addiction and destroy your mind and your body. So again, here's this very, do not do this, never use this, avoid anything that can produce a high. It calls out marijuana by name, which is interesting. Here is the new version. Do things that will strengthen your body. Nothing that will hurt or damage it. Enjoy with gratitude the many good things God has provided. But remember that alcohol, tobacco, coffee, tea, and other harmful drugs and substances are not for your body or your spirit. Even helpful substances like prescription drugs can be destructive if not used correctly. Bonnie in the chat is reminding me that movie was called Meet the Mormons. Thanks, Bonnie. Okay, so I like this certainly better. I think there's room for improvement, but it begins by saying, do things that will strengthen your body. Like the whole stupid thing with COVID was like, get injected, wear a mask, avoid people, lock yourself in your home. And it was never like, have good nutrition, keep up exercise, get sunlight, like all these positive things that you can do to boost your body's immune system and, ward off, disease or significant side effects or whatever. There was nothing, even from church leadership, it was like just encouragement to just go along with what the government was saying. So I like this. It begins by saying, do things that will strengthen your body. Don't do things that will hurt or damage it. That's a very broad principle. This could apply to caffeine. All those So Delicious and whatever, the Swig and all these shops where people are just guzzling sugar and caffeine, right? Like, if we're teaching people correct principles and letting them govern themselves, I think the correct principle, if we're saying don't do things that will hurt or damage your body, includes, copious amounts, regular amounts of sugar and caffeine. And yet people are governing themselves, and those businesses are thriving in Utah County and throughout the state. So this continues. I already read this, but the other part that I'll call out was, alcohol, tobacco, coffee, tea, and other harmful drugs and substances are not for your body or your spirit. So I think that's a little softer than saying never use, as it did before, or do not drink these things. It's just saying these aren't for your body or your spirit. It's a little softer language. Of course, I think it also misses the mark because it's using the modern and incorrect interpretation of the word of wisdom. See my past Sunday musing all about that, because I go into detail there, which I won't today. But it's not a surprise that it's going to continue that interpretation, but I do like this as an improvement because it's softer language. It focuses on positive things that we should be doing for your body, strengthen your body, enjoy with gratitude the many good things God has provided. I think it's good to see some of that positive language rather than these bullet points of do not do this, do not do that, thou shalt not, right? Okay, here's dating. Again, the 2011... I'll just call it the previous from now on. The previous for the strength of youth. You should not date until you are at least 16 years old. When you begin dating, go with one or more additional couples. Avoid going on frequent dates with the same person. Here's the new language. While you are young, build good friendships with many people. In some cultures, youth get to know members of the opposite sex through wholesome group activities. For your emotional and spiritual development and safety, one-on-one activities should be postponed until you are mature. Age 16 is a good guideline. Counsel with your parents and leaders. Save exclusive relationships for when you are older. So much better. So much better, right? Postpone one-on-one activities until you are mature. Well, what does maturity mean? There are mature 15-year-olds and there are highly immature 20-year-olds, right? It's not like, oh, so many days have passed since you came out of your mother's birth canal. You are magically, ready to go on one-on-one dates. Like, that's the whole reason why I think the age of legal adulthood being tied to when you magically turn 18 is also silly, because these arbitrary dates do not suggest any type of, maturity or competence or anything of the like. So I like here that it says one-on-one activities should be postponed until you are mature. And then for context or clarification, it adds age 16 is a good guideline, not a mandate. Or again, previously it said you should not date until you are at least 16 years old. So that has gone away. Now age 16 is a quote unquote good guideline, not the guideline, not God's guideline, not, a scriptural guideline. It's just a good guideline. But if rules are made to be broken, guidelines are meant to be these, narrow, like massive, broad tunnels through which you can drive all kinds of exceptional circumstances. And that's important because different people's circumstances are different from others, and we should have these broader principles and guidelines that allow for adaptivity and flexibility. Counsel with your parents and leaders. Save exclusive relationships for when you're older. It doesn't say 17 or 20 or just when you're older. Like, in general, it's good to take this slow. In general, it's good to, right? I think this is far superior. Okay, here's clothing. Modesty. In the previous version, it said, immodest clothing is any clothing that is tight, sheer, or revealing in any other manner. Young women should avoid short shorts and short skirts, shirts that do not cover the stomach, and clothing that does not cover the shoulders or is low cut in the front or back. Young men should also maintain modesty in their appearance. Young men and young women should be neat and clean and avoid being extreme or inappropriately casual in clothing, hairstyle, and behavior. They should choose appropriately modest apparel when participating in sports. The fashions of the world will change, but the Lord's standards will not change. So all of that was from the previous For the Strength of Youth pamphlet. I find it interesting how female-centric it is, right? there's all kinds of prescriptive language for the young women. Avoid short shorts, short skirts, shirts that do not cover the stomach, clothing that does not cover the shoulders or is low cut in the front or the back. I mean, that's 5 things for the young women. And then for the young men, it just says, young men should also maintain modesty in their appearance without any prescriptive language. And I mean, perhaps some of this is obvious and, the female body versus the male body and all those things, but I do find that an interesting aspect of the previous version. Here's the new version. Again, dealing with clothing and modesty. Avoid styles that emphasize or draw inappropriate attention to your physical body instead of who you are as a child of God with an eternal future. Let moral cleanliness and love for God guide your choices. Seek counsel from your parents. Your respect for yourself and others will increase as you honor your body through your behavior, appearance, and dress. Like, so much better, right? And I love the emphasis, again, like, your body is a gift and enjoy good things from God, and like these things in previous sections. Here it's saying, don't do things that are going to distract from you being able to remember who you are as a child of God with an eternal future. That is the principle. That is what should be the focus. Not just this micromanagerial, like, is your hem, too short, and is the skirt too high? And I have on our wall at the Libertas office a variety of images showing, unjust government power and how stupid the state can be. One of the images is of there have been a couple. One is of a police officer on a beach holding a measuring tape from the ground to the bottom of the woman's bathing suit because the local city had passed an ordinance regulating the length of bathing suits. And so that police officer was there to inspect appropriate attire. Another image is of this big, beefy police officer guy grabbing this woman in a bathing suit, and he's got her lifted off the ground and is carrying her into the police truck, the little cop wagon, to throw her in the back because she was being arrested for being insufficiently modest. So I think there is a problem when we create these arbitrary decrees of what is and is not modest, and when we become overly prescriptive rather than keeping an eye towards the principle. If we focus on the thou shalt nots and do not do that and insufficiently appropriate, we're not thinking of the positive principle in a lot of cases. So I like that this language is shifting our attention, right? Your respect for yourself and others will increase as you honor your body through your behavior, appearance, and dress. That's a great standard. That's something any parent can do, to just have a conversation and say, honey, do you really think that that attire is appropriate to honor your body and to, remember who you are as a child of God, and have a discussion about, appropriateness and some flexibility for different circumstances. So I think that's much better. Okay, media, movies. I think it was the 2000 whatever, the version before last of the For the Strength of You pamphlet also had the no rated R movies. That was dropped, so that's not in the previous 2011 version. So here is a few bits and pieces of what the 2011 previous version of the pamphlet said for media. Choose wisely when using media because whatever you read, listen to, or look at has an effect on you. Select only media that uplifts you. Do not attend, view, or participate in anything that is vulgar, immoral, violent, or pornographic in any way. Do not participate in anything that presents immorality or violence as acceptable. Have the courage to walk out of a movie, change your music, or turn off a computer, television, or mobile device if what you see or hear drives away the spirit. Do not listen to music that encourages immorality or glorifies violence through its lyrics, beat, or intensity. Do not listen to music that uses vulgar or offensive language or promotes evil practices, etc., etc. Here's the new version. As you make choices about what to watch, read, listen to, or participate in, think about how it makes you feel. Does it invite good thoughts? Stay away from anything that mocks sacred things or that is immoral. Don't participate in anything that dulls your judgment or sensitivity to the spirit, such as violence, alcohol, or harmful drugs. Have the courage to turn off a video or a game, walk out of a movie theater, etc. Turn away from anything that is not consistent with the spirit. So some of this language is retained, right? Don't participate in anything, violence, immorality, vulgarity, stay away from things that mock sacred things. So some of the language is retained, but I see several points in here where it's saying, like, how does this make you feel? Does it invite good thoughts? Be careful with sacred things. It's about what's consistent with the Spirit. So I think there is a little bit more of a helpful approach here to simplify that whole section and to give it the context it needs, which is what we're really worried about is whether you can keep the Spirit as you think about your media consumption, what you're viewing or watching. You know, this is something that, anyways, I'll say for later that I titled this For the Strength of Adults. And I have a point with that title because this different approach for the youth I find interesting in light of what adults have been told and are told today. But we'll get to that in just a moment. I think, a couple more little examples here. Okay, let's see. Pornography. Previous version. Use of pornography is a serious sin and can lead to other sexual transgression. Avoid pornography at all costs. It is a poison that weakens your self-control, destroys your feelings of self-worth, and changes the way you see others. If you are involved in pornography, cease now. Seek the help you need. Your parents and bishop can help you, etc. The new version is twice as long, but there's some interesting approaches here. So here's the new version. Pornography is a representation in pictures or words that is designed to arouse sexual feelings. Pornography comes in many forms, including videos, pictures, books, and music. It can also be messages or images sent between friends. Pornography treats things that are sacred, our physical bodies and sexual feelings, with disrespect. You may come across pornography without meaning to. Whether you come across pornography intentionally or not, turn away immediately. You may also want to talk with a parent or other trusted adult. Intentionally viewing pornography is sinful and harms your ability to feel the Spirit. It weakens your self-control and distorts the way you see yourself and others. Jesus Christ has the power to help you resist it and repent. Turn toward Him, turn away from darkness. Your bishop can help you and receive strength and forgiveness through the Savior. I find this interesting for a few reasons. First is it very much has this recognition that this is prevalent. This is a huge deal. Twice as much text as before. And with that, this recognition, I feel like that you basically can't avoid it. Like all kids are going to get exposed to this at some point. And so the previous language was kind of shame-inducing language, right? It's a serious sin. It's a poison, right? And making people who even inadvertently saw this kind of stuff or were exposed to it feel shameful and guilty that they had sinned or that, they had consumed poison into their spirit. And so here there's recognition that, you may come across it without meaning to. Turn away immediately. This more kind of helpful, empowering language of like, here's how you handle it in situations like this. And then also clarifying that the sin is intentionally viewing it. It adds that modifier, which I find interesting and important in a world where, again, kids are all going to see this stuff. And also, again, the positive language about, the principle here, why it's not just, it's a poison, avoid it, repent now, never do it. The language is, these are sacred things. And it harms the way we see ourselves. And Jesus can help us resist it. And we should, turn towards light and truth and all the things. So I like that this is better language as a parent, to talk to my kids about this, and rather than do not do this, it's poison, blah, 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 right? Now it gives the context it needs and focuses on the principle, the correct principle to help our kids better govern themselves. This was interesting to me, a section about using like social media and devices. In the previous version, it says, spending long periods of time using the internet or a mobile device, playing video games, watching TV, blah, 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 can keep you from valuable interactions with other people. Be careful that your use of social media does not replace spending time with your family and friends. Back in 2011, when social media was kind of just on the rise. So I think that was decent language. But I find this interesting in the new one. Be careful that your use of technology and media does not replace spending in-person time with family and friends. Social media and other technology can take much of your time without giving a lot of value in return. Take a break from the virtual world and connect with people in real life. I find that interesting in a post-COVID world. I find it interesting in light of the so-called metaverse on the rise. I find it interesting how we're so connected through social media, yet disconnected from one another. And it's kind of anti-social media in a lot of ways. I like this language. I like that the emphasis is on in-person connection, human connection. And I think that's going to be very useful language. Okay, final example. Maybe. Let's see. Do not use, previous version for language. Do not use profane, vulgar, or crude language or gestures, and do not tell jokes or stories about immoral actions. These are offensive to God and to others. New version. Make sure your language reflects love of God and others, whether you're communicating in person or virtually. Say things that uplift, nothing that might be divisive, hurtful, or offensive, even as a joke. Your words can be powerful. Let them be powerful for good. Again, shifting from the negative to the positive rather than do not do this. Now it's like, here's the principle. Here's what we're trying to do. Make sure to act consistently with that. This was interesting. We did youth dances growing up. That was like a big thing. Do they still do those anymore? I don't even know. My kids aren't old enough. I've got a 13-year-old, so maybe I'll find out soon enough. But I feel like I'm in the young men's, in the teachers' presidency. I don't think I've ever heard about a stake youth dance. I haven't been in there a while, but the previous version had a lot to say about dancing. It can be fun, but avoid full body contact with your partner. Do not use positions or moves that are suggestive of sexual or violent behavior or are otherwise inappropriate. Attend only those dances where dress, grooming, lighting, lyrics, music, and entertainment contribute to a wholesome atmosphere where the spirit may be present. It's a lot to say about dances. Here's all the new version says about dancing, and it's in a longer list of things. It's not even dedicated about dancing. So what I'm about to say removes some of the unrelated words and references that are in this long sentence. Have the courage to walk out of a dance that is not consistent with the Spirit. And that's in that sentence where it's talking about have the courage to turn off a movie or stop playing the music or walk out of a dance. And so it's this, again, broad principle. We want to act in harmony with the Spirit. So have the courage to walk out rather than do not do this and body positions and blah, 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 and lyrics and all the things. So much better there. All right, I'll end with the kissing one. I think the earliest version used the word heavy petting or something like that, a previous version, but the 2011 version, here's what it says about intimacy. Never do anything that could lead to sexual transgression. Treat others with respect, not as objects used to satisfy lustful and selfish desires. Before marriage, do not participate in passionate kissing, lie on top of another person, or touch the private, sacred parts of another person's body with or without clothing. Do not do anything else that arouses sexual feelings. Do not arouse those emotions in your own body. Pay attention to the promptings of the Spirit so that you can be clean and virtuous. The Spirit of the Lord will withdraw from one who is in sexual transgression. So that's kind of the no French kissing, no lying on top of one another, don't touch their body parts, etc., etc. Here's the new version. Keep sex and sexual feelings sacred. They should not be the subject of jokes or entertainment. Outside of marriage between a man and a woman, it is wrong to touch the private, sacred parts of another person's body, even if clothed. In your choices about what to do, look at, read, listen to, think about, post, or text, avoid anything that purposely arouses lustful emotions in others or yourself. Nothing about kissing, nothing about lying. It's just, again, the general principle is this is sacred stuff. Let's make sure that we're not doing anything in conflict with that. So other examples abound, but those are, I think, some of the highlights to show you the different approach that's being taken with the For the Strength pamphlet. And what I liked is when Uchtdorf was presenting this, he said that by focusing on general principles, it can help young members, quote, make righteous choices based on eternal truths. Again, I think that's consistent with how Joseph allegedly, was teaching people in Nauvoo. For those just turning in, it was John Taylor who in 1851 said he overheard Joseph tell this legislator guy, oh, how I govern people so well in Nauvoo is I teach them correct principles and I let them govern themselves. I think the new For the Strength of Youth pamphlet is much more in line with that sentiment. And for that reason, I think it's a serious improvement for our church to get away from this very kind of pharisaical, micromanagerial, past version that was a lot more prescriptive. Okay, but what about adults? Hence the title of today's musing. Because as this was all being talked about, I had to wonder, well, are adults treated the same way? And look, maybe this is a sign of what's to come. Maybe this is a shift in perspective. Maybe we will see alterations to the handbook and to other literature and to statements from general authorities that will be in line with this more hands-off approach. And I would welcome that. I think that that would be a very important thing to do. But as it stands, there are a number of things that have been happening that are inconsistent with, this new approach. If we rewind the clock back a little bit, I remember a family member who, I think it was the year 2000, President Hinckley, in like a Relief Society general conference type meeting, that's when he announced the one pair of earring rule, and basically said, you shouldn't have more than one pair. And this family member of mine took it as a point of pride that she immediately pulled out the other earrings, threw them in the trash can there in the chapel, and walked out, never to wear a second pair of earrings again. And so I think that's an example. I think the BYU honor code is, very pharisaical in a lot of ways. I think the current interpretation of the word of wisdom. Again, I did a past musing about that, so I won't go into that. I did one about BYU as well, past musing about that. I think, some of these are cultural things, but I think of like this idea that you shouldn't have a beard if, you're in a bishopric. I think that's loosening up at kind of a stake level. In fact, we just had someone called into our bishopric who, he did have kind of a Lorenzo Snow looking beard. It was like a foot long. And so he trimmed it to be, once he was called into the bishopric. He still has a beard, which, mad props, because even that, I think, in a lot of places is verboten in the church, but culturally. But we got these cultural things that are present. I think COVID was a great example of this problem for adults, where it was very prescriptive. Right? It was this encouragement to wear the mask, to get vaccinated. We were urged to do so. We were told that it was safe and effective. We were told that it's a Christ-like love. That's what Elder Renlund said, that is a sign of Christ-like love to wear a mask. To which I say, well, there's a flu all the time. There's all kinds of other airborne diseases. Like, how do we define what is, shouldn't we be wearing masks all the time because there's always airborne viruses? Like, it just opens a can of worms for me to say stuff like that. But again, this implication that you should be doing this. You should wear a mask. You should get vaccinated. And the problem, maybe you saw it in your ward, but I certainly felt it in mine, is these things are weaponized by members of the church to judge one another, right? When everyone's wearing masks, and when my family shows up and we're not wearing masks, we feel the lasers on our back. Like, it feels uncomfortable to be in a ward in which, that's happening. Or even like 4th of July, right? Everyone stands up to sing God Save the King, or, Star Spangled Banner. And my family and I remain seated. We're not standing up at the kind of, like everyone else is at the bishop's direction when he stands up and everyone else stands up. So some of this is more cultural than prescriptive from the church, but some of it is prescriptive, like with COVID and saying, everyone should be wearing a mask and getting vaccinated. Even something like telling members to go to their caucus meetings in Utah, right? And like, hey, we urge you to go do this. Rather than teaching the principle of, civic engagement or standing up for important causes and, hey, here are some ways to get involved, right? It does bleed over into thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that at a very specific level. There's a manual, it's right here, let me grab it, called True to the Faith. So this was put out in 2004, True to the Faith, a gospel reference. And the intent of this is, so here's the First Presidency message at the time. This book is designed as a companion to your study of the scriptures and the teachings of the Latter-day Prophets. We encourage you to refer to it as you study and apply gospel principles. Use it as a resource, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this, it's got this whole long list of things. And among them, here are just a few things in the book. Latter-day Prophets strongly discourage the piercing of the body, except for medical purposes. If girls or women desire to have their ears pierced, they are encouraged to wear only one pair of modest earrings. Those who choose to disregard this counsel show a lack of respect for themselves and for God. They will someday regret their decision. Here's another. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is opposed to gambling, including lotteries sponsored by governments. The First Presidency has encouraged us to join with others in opposing the legalization and government sponsorship of any form of gambling in our communities. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Like the stock market is gambling in a lot of ways. Like so. Anyways, topic for another day. Maybe that'll be a topic. In addition to avoiding clothing that is revealing, keep in mind this is not a For the Strength of Youth pamphlet. This is for adults. This is for everyone. In addition to avoiding clothing that is revealing, you should also avoid extremes in clothing, appearance, and hairstyle. In dress, grooming, and manners, always be neat and clean, never sloppy or inappropriately casual. Do not disfigure yourself with tattoos or body piercings. If you are a woman and you desire to have your ears pierced, wear only one pair of modest earrings. So it's in two places in the true to the, they must really mean it. They put it in there in two separate sections about these single pair of earrings. Here's a final example I'll share. Anything harmful that people purposefully take into their bodies is not in harmony with the word of wisdom. This is especially true of illegal drugs, which can destroy those who become addicted to them. Stay entirely away from them. Do not experiment with them. The abuse of prescription drugs also leads to destructive addiction. Again, like this modern interpretation of the word of wisdom that calls them illegal drugs and outsources God's approval of certain substances to political bodies who exist simply because they won a popularity contest and who have no moral basis to understand what is and is not okay for someone to ingest. Like the fact that the church constrains the word of wisdom in a lot of ways to say illegal drugs, I think is the wrong modifier. I mean, cannabis is currently illegal, and yet tens of thousands of people are able to now access it and are being helped by it. So, and anything harmful that people let me start over. Anything harmful that people purposefully take into their bodies is not in harmony with the word of wisdom. Well, I mean, again, like caffeine and sugar, and we could talk about all kind like GMO processed foods, and anything harmful is I mean, going to crumble, right? Like it's like going to church activities and you're eating donuts and someone says the prayer, please bless this to nourish and strengthen our bodies. Like, anyways, I could go off on that. I also found it interesting as I think of, okay, if the church is going to go in this direction, this Joseph Smith direction of focusing more on the principles and getting away from the micromanagerial things, maybe this true to the faith manual thing needs to be updated. But what about the handbook? The handbook is the source of a lot of kind of prescriptive statements and specific things, particularly in section 38, which has all these kind of general statements and policies on people in the church. Here are just a few that I reviewed. I found this one interesting. This is 38.2.8.8. I don't think I'll give references for everything because that would be kind of silly, but the title is Persons Who Have Been Convicted of Crimes. Persons who have been convicted of crimes may not be baptized until they complete their terms of imprisonment. This is true for converts and for those seeking readmission. Persons who have been convicted of felonies or any crimes involving sexual misconduct may not be baptized and confirmed until they have also completed their terms of probation or parole. Only the First Presidency may grant an exception. So if you've been convicted of a felony, even a white-collar crime, even Harvey Silverglate wrote a really interesting book called 3 Felonies a Day, and he reviewed all these laws and regulations, and his analysis was that the average American commits 3 felonies a day because of how many things are a crime. And things that are like not even like a big deal, right? They're not what we would call malum in se crimes, like inherently bad things. It's just, this law's on the books, and now you're a felon because you did something different. And so to tie our ability to be baptized to whether governments consider something a felony or not I find that curious and potentially problematic. There's a section on female genital mutilation. It says simply, the church condemns female genital mutilation. Doesn't say anything about male genital mutilation, perhaps because of this whole Abrahamic holdover of circumcision, which has been done away in Christ, and yet, we did not circumcise our son. I think it's abuse. I don't think there's any reason to. God doesn't require it. Maybe he never did. Maybe that was cultural and not revealed. Who knows? But I don't think that there's any need today. So it's curious that the church condemns the female version but not the male version. Again, what's the principle? Maybe the principle instead is God has given us these bodies as a gift. As it says in the For the Strength of Youth pamphlet, we should honor it and not do anything to permanently disfigure it. When you're cutting off a little baby boy's foreskin, that's permanent. So maybe we can go more towards that principled approach rather than only side with female genital mutilation. Here's a section on medical and health care. Seeking competent medical help, exercising faith, and receiving priesthood blessings work together for healing according to the will of the Lord. Members should not use or promote medical or health practices that are ethically, spiritually, or legally questionable. Those who have health problems should consult with competent medical professionals who are licensed in the areas where they practice. Again, I find it silly to require licensure. A government permission slip is a basis for what we can or cannot do with our own bodies. I don't know that God cares about occupational licensure, but I'll stick with cannabis as an example. Using cannabis is legally questionable. Many doctors believe still that it's ethically questionable, that it's medically questionable. I think of mental health and psychedelics right now. That's extremely questionable to a lot of people, and yet it is some of the most promising opportunity and substance for people with depression and anxiety and PTSD. Why shouldn't people, members of the church, be able to promote or utilize those practices? Again, let's focus on the principle, which is, we should treat our bodies as sacred. We should treat these substances with caution and respect. We should seek guidance from competent professionals, not licensed professionals, but, competent, because there are incompetent licensed professionals. It does actually say here, should consult with competent medical professionals who are licensed. Seek counsel through prayer and pondering and with the counsel of these leaders, and then leave it at that. I think that would be beneficial. This was added a couple years ago after Prop 2. So I guess this is our fault probably that this is in the handbook, but there's a whole section dealing with medical marijuana. And this was done after we legalized it in Utah over the initial objections of the church. It says, the church opposes the use of marijuana for non-medical purposes. However, marijuana may be used for medicinal purposes when the following conditions are met. Number 1, the use is determined to be medically necessary by a licensed physician or another legally approved medical provider. Number 2, the person follows the dosage and mode of administration from the physician or authorized medical provider. The church does not approve of vaping marijuana unless the medical provider has authorized it based on medical necessity. And then the final statement, the church does not approve of smoking marijuana, including for medical purposes. That is very in the weeds about vaping and smoking and dosage forms. And part of this is because that's how our negotiations ended up with the church. And there was a lot of discussion about the legal requirements of, specifying the dosage forms and saying no to smoking and allowing vaping only in certain circumstances. So they kind of took the template that we landed on for the legislation and they put it into the general church handbook for all the members of the church. But again, to me, this is too in the weeds. We should instead teach correct principles and let people govern themselves. A couple other examples. Vaccinations. The handbook says, vaccinations administered by competent medical professionals protect health and preserve life. Members of the church are encouraged to safeguard themselves, their children, and their communities through vaccination, period. That's like calling the COVID jab, safe and effective when it's neither. It's neither. It's not safe. It's not effective. To just say here, broadly speaking, that vaccinations protect health and preserve life. Do the influenza vaccinations do that? No. They guess. Did you know that when they're figuring out what flu vaccine, they're going to mass produce for the population, they are guessing, they're doing their best to anticipate what will be the dominant strain of influenza. They create all these COVID vaccines and then COVID, whatever you call it, mutates. And now we got a different one. And so that vaccine is not effective and It's in a lot of cases not safe. Too many cases, sadly. We've heard a lot of stories of people having myocarditis and all these kinds of athletes and people just falling dead on the field and at home. And so here to say that vaccines protect health and preserve life, I think is wrong. And I think we should instead focus on the principle. We should take proper precautionary measures to maintain and increase our health, and only put things in our bodies that are, proven to contribute to health, or focus on the general principle rather than being so specific and saying vaccines preserve life. Laws of the land. Here's a section. Members should obey, honor, and sustain the laws in any country where they live or travel. Period. Is that true? I'll not go into detail on this because a couple weeks ago when I did my musing for Constitution Day about the Constitution, I talked in depth about what the laws of the land means, why that term is used, and why it's actually God's law, not the decrees of politicians. So if you missed that one, you can go back and listen to that past musing. One final example. Taxes. Taxation is theft, right? And so here's what's in the handbook. Church members are to obey the tax laws of the nation where they live. Members who disagree with tax laws can challenge them as the laws of their country permit. Church members are in conflict with the law and with church teachings if they, number one, intentionally fail or refuse to pay required taxes. Number two, make frivolous legal arguments to avoid paying taxes. Or number three, refuse to comply with a final judgment in a tax proceeding that requires them to pay taxes. These members may be ineligible for a temple recommend. They should not be called to leadership positions in the church. A church membership council is required if a member is convicted of a felony for violating tax laws. That's super interesting. So you can be convicted of a felony for stealing from your employer or anyone. And then, maybe you go to prison, you're punished, you're on probation and parole, but you can be in good standing in the church. If you steal from anyone else, but if you steal from Caesar, and that's not even the right way to put it, if you refuse to allow Caesar to steal from you, a church membership council is required. They may be ineligible for a temple recommend, and they should not be called to leadership positions in the church. Not because you stole from anyone else, but because you refuse to let Caesar steal from you. Wow. And I think I know where this is coming from. It's been years since I read into this. There's all kinds of people who make arguments that under the 16th Amendment, that they're not a person, that that's actually a corporation. They're not subject to taxes. There are people who have apparently been able to get out of paying the income tax by challenging in court and showing, how to evade it. Interestingly, as a very quick tangent, what woke me up, what red-pilled me, was a documentary in 2005 or 6 by the late Aaron Russo called America, Freedom to Fascism. And he was documenting the decline of America from, these ideals of classical liberalism into the kind of pseudo aristocratic, totalitarian, whatever you want to call the, farce of a republic we have today. And so the documentary, in part, focused on this tax argument and showed these tax evaders and how they were challenging it in court. And so that was kind of my first introduction. I've since met people who apparently have, succeeded in not having to pay income tax, or so they say. But whether you comply or not, and as I talk about in Christ versus Caesar, there's a lot of kind of pragmatic considerations to take when you decide which laws you're going to break and why and how, even though a lot of these laws, so-called, are invalid and unconstitutional or immoral. But there's a serious consideration you have to take about whether you want to incur Caesar's wrath. Interestingly, it's on this tax issue itself that the church also imposes its own form of punishment for violating Caesar's laws. That doesn't exist for if you, sell drugs to kids or, beat your wife or embezzle money from your business or, drive drunk and, hit someone on the road. Like all those crimes, you can still be in good standing in the church. You pay your time, you do whatever, right? But you're not going to have a council convene. You're not going to not be able to go to the temple. But if you refuse to let Caesar steal from you and take all your, not all, but take your money via taxation, suddenly these things are mandatory. So that's kind of interesting to me. And I suspect, and I'm trying to recall from years ago when I last looked into this, I think, the church was responding to some of these people being Mormons and teaching. Like in the handbook, there's all this stuff about energy healing, which they just added in. So they're discouraging energy healing. They're discouraging like these self-help courses that are trying to, because they're responding to these things that kind of bubble up in the church community and people are doing this. So then the church adds a thing to the handbook and they poo-poo, whatever that latest thing is. There's all this stuff about the occult, and all this kind of stuff. So my recollection is that there was once upon a time a lot of attention to some of these cases where members of the church or others were trying to do this. And so now we have this, just like we had a shoe bomber and now you got to take your shoes off at the TSA, or we had an underwear bomber and now we have to let them, put fingers down our pants. Like these one-time things create these prolonged, restrictions on our freedom. And so here we have in the handbook this decree that you will be spiritually punished if you refuse to allow Caesar to steal from you. I find that very odd. Again, I would prefer that we focus on the principle. Be honest in your dealings with your fellow man. Obey the laws of the land, God's law. Be judicious in civil disobedience. Not that the church manual would ever say that, but I think focusing on the principle would help us avoid some of this minutia where they have to kind of come in each time and be so, or feel they need to be so prescriptive. So, for the strength of youth, things are improving. The new pamphlet is going in a much better direction, I believe, by pointing towards Christ, by talking about the principle, by reminding young people about what it's really about. It's not just this list of do not do this and do not do that. It's about remembering that we are children of God. Our bodies are a gift. We should try and represent him. We should try and, choose the right, love God, love our fellow man. That to me is the right approach. I'm glad to see the change. I'm hopeful that this change will expand and continue far beyond just the youth. I would hope that we adults, as mature as we are and with more experience that we have, are afforded a similar, if not greater, level of theocratic flexibility. I don't know what the term is, right? This idea that let's agree on and focus on the underlying principles and let people govern themselves and not create this minutia, these pharisaical prescriptions that just lead many members to judge one another, right? Oh, you're not wearing a mask. You're not following the prophet, right? Oh, you have 2 earrings. You're a sinner. Oh, you're wearing a blue shirt. You have a beard. Like you're a deacon and you're not holding your left arm to the square behind your back, like some wards are like fanatically insistent upon, right? Let's get rid of all of that. Let's focus on first principles. Let's focus on the gospel. Let's focus on Christ. And by restructuring some of these other issues to an alignment with principle rather than a list of thou shalt nots, I think we're going to do a lot better as a church community. I think it's going to be a lot better to have unity with other people who may decide differently. I mean, think of tithing, right? Tithing is a good example. There's no specific prescription of 10% of, post-tax earnings or pre-tax earnings. And I mean, it'd be a lot better if we actually lived tithing the way the scripture said, which I did a past musing about that. And if you haven't listened to that one, that is one you'll want to go back and listen to. It's perhaps in your financial interest to do so. But the tithing is a good example, right? It's here's a general principle. You follow it as you best understand it. And members aren't weaponizing against one another, and they're in part because, everyone's financial transactions are secret, so you don't really know who's doing what. But we're not judging other people for paying post-tax or pre-tax or whatever, right? It's understood to be a broad principle, and people can interpret what that means for them. And I think that's a good thing, especially because when people in positions of power have their own preferred definition, right? Mormonism is saying Mormon is a victory for Satan. When other leaders of the church completely disagreed, it shows that when people are in a position of power, they can impose their preference on people when we have this kind of micromanaged nature, rather than instead, like Joseph allegedly, let's just teach correct principles and let people govern themselves. I'm hopeful that as a church, we go more in that direction. I think we'll have more unity. as in our congregations. I think we'll have it'll be more attractive to people to not feel like they're joining this kind of Pharisaical sect of all these like micromanagerial prescriptions. And I am fearful that notwithstanding these revised statements, the culture is going to continue to cling to these past things, like the rated R stuff, right? I've watched a number of rated R movies that were fantastic. And yet there are many people in the church who are like, oh, rated R, the Motion Picture Association decreed that is, verboten. Therefore, you're a sinner if you watch a movie that they assigned this arbitrary label to. Like, some of that is holdover from decades ago, and yet it still infects the church culture, and people still cling to these kind of arbitrary, decrees of what is and what is not good. So I am fearful that notwithstanding these good changes, it's going to be hard to let go of traditions of our fathers, right? And a lot of people are going to continue to determine spirituality and righteousness based on these kind of more Pharisaical prescriptions that many in the church apparently are trying to move away from. So I'm hopeful and fearful. We'll see where this goes. Maybe things will improve, and I'm hopeful that we can just continue and increase focusing on principles and let people govern themselves. See you next Sunday.